What happened to Jane? The possible replacement of Jane Asher. Think of Jane Asher. What is the first occupation you associate with her? If I asked people today, especially those who are younger, I'm willing to suggest that they would probably say something to do with baking. Yes, she is an actress, an author, and a businesswoman, but I believe the Jane Asher of today's true passion is baking. Here are a couple of images of Jane Asher in 1994 and 2012. The lady on the left is the Jane that I recognise from when I was 14. All through the 90s, Jane was the representative of McVitie's Biscuits. She was chosen for the role because of her association with baking. She made about 15 TV adverts for the brand in the 90s, plus half a dozen magazine adverts. Here are a couple. They're quite racy compared to the TV adverts. She is naked in the one on the left, with her modesty preserved by the back of a chair. Also in 1994, I watched the film Mask of the Red Death for the first time. My older brother was, and still is, a huge film buff. He loves Hammer horror films and introduced them to me. We watched this film together, and I remember the conversation that we had at the time. That the Jane Asher that was in the film was not the same Jane Asher that bakes cakes and stars in biscuit adverts. Yes, she was only 18 in Mask of the Red Death, but no amount of years could change her height, her frame, the length of her face or nose, and most crucially, the shape of her ears. I then went on to watch Alfie to double-check that I wasn't going mad. Again, I got the impression that this Jane Asher, who really took her acting career very seriously, was not the lady who bakes the cakes, as I have come to think of her. Before we take a critical look at pictures of Jane, let's first consider her family background. Her father, Dr. Richard Asher, was born on the 3rd of April 1912 in Brighton, Sussex. He was an endocrinologist and hematologist. He was the senior physician responsible for the mental observation ward at the Central Middlesex Hospital. He also studied the effects of sleep hypnosis and other forms of hypnosis. Dr. Asher suddenly gave up his hospital post in 1964. This happened just after Paul McCartney came to live with the Asher family. Ask yourself this question. What father invites a random pop star to live with their family? Was Jane being used as bait to lure Paul into the Asher home? The affection between Jane and Paul seemed genuine, but this living arrangement is strange. Memoir states on page 17 that Dr. Asher and his wife Margaret were involved in hypnotic experiments involving Paul. This is how the melody for the song Yesterday was seeded into his mind. Memoirs claims that George Martin provided the song based on Nat King Cole's cover of Answer Me My Love to Margaret, who repeatedly played the tune on the piano to Paul whilst he was in a trance. Dr. Asher's death by suicide on the 25th of April 1969, aged 57, was suspicious. He was found dead in his own basement after being missing for several days. Jane's mother, Margaret Asher, was born on the 26th of February 1914 in St Pancras, London. This is a photo of her in 1967, aged 53. In my opinion, she and Jane look unalike. Margaret was born to the Honourable Edward Granville Elliot, who was the younger brother of Montague Charles Elliot, the 8th Earl of St. Germans. The Elliots have an ancestral family home in Port Eliot, Cornwall, comprising of a Grade 1 listed mansion with its own church and gardens. Margaret's uncle, the 8th Earl, was also a holder of the Knight Commander of the Victorian Order and an OBE, which he gained for his service with the Royal Navy. He held many courtier positions, which directly involved service to the monarchs King George V, King Edward VIII, King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth II. Margaret's father studied history at Oxford and then tried to become an actor and playwright. After poor reviews, he went on to become a solicitor until the outbreak of World War I. He became a captain in the British Army for the Royal Garrison Artillery in 1916. Margaret was a professor of oboe at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, where she taught George Martin, the Beatles' producer. Margaret died on the 27th of February 2011 from dementia. Jane Asher was born on the 5th of April 1946 in Wollaston, London. She has a brother, Peter, and a sister, Claire. All three are featured as children in the Spotlight Casting Directory advert in 1956. All three of them have been involved in performing of some kind. Even in this advert, it states that Jane is already a good pianist at the age of 10. It also says that she can sing. Later on, she also took up the classical guitar. This advert also states that all three of the Asher children have red hair. Redheads, especially ones with blue eyes, are genetic rarities. It would be genetically impossible for all three of them to have red hair unless both of their parents also had red hair. All photographs of their parents are in monochrome, so I can neither confirm nor deny their status. And here's a couple of pictures of the Asher children, both as children and as adults, with Jane. According to this 1965 article, Jane was 5'5" tall. On Jane's current IMDb biography, she is listed as 5'6". Cynthia Lennon, in her book called John, said that the first time she met Jane, the things that most struck her about Jane's appearance were the fineness of her features, her shiny red hair, and her bright blue eyes. She refers to Jane as one of the beauties of the 60s. She said that Paul McCartney was as proud as a peacock to have Jane as his girlfriend and fell for her like a ton of bricks. Jane met Paul on the 18th of April 1963, when she was sent by the Radio Times to interview the Beatles at the Royal Albert Hall. On that day, she also took part in a photo shoot for the magazine, in which she was snapped screaming for the group. She was 17 years old at the time. Paul turned 21 later that year. 8 months later, in December 1963, Paul moved into the Asher residence in Wimpole Street, Marylebone, and stayed there until the couple relocated to St John's Wood in 1966. The real Jane was a musician. Considering her mother was a classical musician and professor of oboe at a very respected music school, this isn't surprising. In the 60s, we can easily find photos of her playing piano and classical guitar. Why don't we see these sorts of images after the 1960s? The real Jane was also into handicrafts, sewing and knitting. We will see some of these hobbies listed in profiles on Jane in the 1960s. In this 1966 fact sheet, some of Jane's personal data is restated. She is again listed as 5 feet 5 inches tall with red hair and blue eyes. It lists her hobbies as sewing and knitting, not cooking and baking. It states her ambition in life is to become a thoroughly accomplished actress. Where is the Jane that had handicrafts as hobbies today? Where is the Jane that sang and played the piano and guitar today? Where is the Jane that took her acting career so seriously that she went on tour with a production for months at a time and took herself away from her friends and family to do so, including Paul and Billy? The Jane we see today is an actress, but the impression she gives is that her true passion is her baking-related career. Now let's think about Jane's height. The real Jane was said to be 5'5". The photo on the right is taken from Masque of the Red Death in 1964. In this photo, Jane is standing next to Vincent Price, who was 6'4". I know we can't see their feet, but in the film they are both wearing flat shoes throughout. So there should be 11 inches difference between their heights. She is wearing a hairpiece, but we can easily see the place where it joins the top of her head. I have put in some red lines to help you see the difference in Jane and Vincent's heights. It definitely seems like a difference of 11 inches. On the left is a photo taken from the Beatles' trip to India in 1968. Jane is standing next to Cynthia Lennon, who was 5'3", and Billy, who was 6'2½". The height difference can be seen between them, but this too seems odd. Are there really 9.5 inches between the heights of Jane and Billy here? She comes up to his brow, so that means there is 9.5 inches between his brow to the top of his head. This seems impossible, so there must be some deception in this photo. Either someone is lying about their height, or someone is lying about who they are. I am more inclined to trust the photo of Jane and Vincent Price. Let's consider a more recent Jane. Here are some still images taken from James May's Toy Stories. It's the episode where they make a life-size garden out of plasticine and exhibit it at the Chelsea Flower Show. In this episode, James recruits many different groups of people to help create flowers out of plasticine for his garden. Jane Asher and her team make highly creative cakes to order, and he used to live near Jane Asher's cake shop in South Kensington. James asks her for her help. In the shot on the left, they walk across the checkerboard floor of her shop and greet each other. We see the difference in their heights. James is just about 6 foot tall, and I know he is because I have stood right next to him in real life when I went to a Top Gear show. I'm not sure that I can see 7 inches of difference in their heights, but at the end of the episode, Jane comes to the Chelsea Flower Show to see James's garden. Again we see their difference in heights on the picture on the right. Their 7-inch difference in height seems more plausible here. I suspect she's wearing flatter shoes because, as anyone who's ever been to the Chelsea Flower Show will attest, you'd have to be crazy to wear anything other than flat shoes at Chelsea. It's a long walk around the exhibition and the ground is either rough or made of grass. Now let's look at Jane's ears. I consider Jane's ears to be the most reliable way to physically identify Jane from other women claiming to be her. Here we have a photo of Jane as a child, and again in 1967, sitting next to Billy, although I have cropped him out of the photo. Note the roundness of her ears. Sometime around 1970, we stopped finding this Jane with the round ears. I've looked through literally hundreds and hundreds of photos of this woman and women claiming to be Jane, and I cannot find this Jane with the round ears anymore. Not after 1970. Look at the Jane on the right. She has long, slim ears with long attached earlobes. Here on the left is another photo of Jane taken in 1966 from a set of promo images of her of the film Alfie. On the right is a version of Jane in 1977 that we can still see today. She also has the long, slim ears with long attached earlobes. Finally, on the left, a photo of Jane a few days before she got engaged to Billy at the end of 1967. Again, she has round ears. The Jane on the right in 2016 still has those long, slim ears with long attached earlobes. Another thing to look at is Jane's teeth. The real Jane has smaller teeth just to the left of her 2 front teeth. The Jane that seems to have replaced her has bigger teeth on the same side. I know a lot of years separate these photos, but we can see the difference in teeth in other photos over the years. I have used these 2 photos to illustrate this point because they are the clearest images I have. Here are a couple of photos of Jane's profile. Possibly they are the same Jane. If not, the Jane on the right is an excellent double. I cannot find any more profile images like this of Jane after 1970, which I find mildly suspicious. Also note that the real Jane had a long swan neck. There aren't many photos of Jane with bare arms. She had a lot of freckles on her arms, which is not really surprising as she was a redhead. Perhaps she was embarrassed by them. By 1970, we start to regularly see images of Jane with no freckles on her arms. Here are some more photos of Jane in 2002 and 2012 with no freckles on her arms. These women are pale. They haven't had spray tans to cover them. Unless they were digitally removed, which seems a bit pointless for such a famously redhead and freckled actress, they should be present. However, some later versions of Jane do appear to have arm freckles, but in a different pattern. Now let's consider some images of Jane from her charity work. Here are two shots from two official appeal videos she made. The one on the left for Parkinson's UK in 2001 looks horrible, like her face has half melted. However, 11 years later, in 2012, she makes another appeal for autism research and looks younger and more attractive. This is very weird. Let's also compare some older Janes. Again, there seems to be a lot of differences between them. Sometimes Jane is even blonde, as seen here on the left. That photo is taken from one of Jane's cookbooks. Okay, maybe she coloured her hair, but what marketing sense does that make? Jane is famously a redhead. If someone walks through a bookstore looking for cookbooks by Jane Asher, they look for a redhead, not a blonde. Let's now look for the real Jane with Paul McCartney. The photo on the right is taken just before the premiere of Alfie. Here are some more images of Jane with Paul. The one on the right is just after the premiere of Alfie. Now some images of Jane with Billy. The height difference between them seems more obvious in these photos. Here, I believe, are genuine photos of Jane from 1966 to 1968. Clockwise, from the far left, we have a photo of her from Alfie, one of her in India, one of her standing in the Indica bookshop, one with Billy, and one taken just before she dumped him on TV in 1968. And more about that event in the next slide. Jane and Billy, as Paul, got engaged on Christmas Day 1967, but it was a farcical arrangement because Billy had already met Linda Eastman on the 15th of May that year. This photo was taken of Jane on the 20th of July 1968, just before she famously dumped Billy on the live broadcast of the D-Time TV show. Jane cryptically said, "I haven't broken it off, but it is finished." It's impossible to know what she was thinking in this photo, but she looks pensive to me, as though she were mulling over her options and what she was about to declare on D-Time. Allegedly, Jane had dumped Billy because she had come home early to find Billy in bed with another woman. Jane was in shock and left immediately. Her mother came back shortly afterwards to collect all of Jane's belongings. So what were the outcomes of Jane's actions on D-Time? Did Jane dump Billy on live TV because she knew no one could interfere with her decision and no one could reverse it or cover it up? Consider Jane's story from her perspective. In 1966, Jane had her boyfriend murdered and then was forced to endure the pretense that nothing had happened and that Billy was Paul. Did she take her own life because she'd finally had enough and saw no other way out of her situation? Did she die before or after the suspicious death of her father in April 1969? If Jane killed herself after dumping Billy on live TV, this would have caused very bad press for Billy. Consider that he is destined to be the center of the New World Order's religion of Paulism. Imagine if Jesus Christ, at the beginning of the establishment of Christianity, had been hampered with a story of a girlfriend that dumped him and committed suicide. How would that have looked? The controllers of this psyop think hundreds of years ahead and would have considered this. Alternatively, did the controllers kill her off and feel the need to replace her as a public figure Do they consider Jane a live wire who deviated from the official script? Or is she still alive today and merely makes the use of a lot of doubles? She has kept a dignified silence on her time with Paul and gets upset when people mention him. Why? Let's consider what she knew in 1968. Jane had lived in the same house where her parents were engaged in hypnotic experiments on the real Paul McCartney, as discussed earlier. Jane knew that Paul was killed in 1966 and replaced by Billy. According to page 125 of Memoirs, Jane went to Paul's funeral. Presumably, she also knew where he was buried. Jane knew important information. Her actions on D-Time could not have been ignored. Is the Jane we see today a lifelong actor who has featured in the official Jane Asher timeline from the late 60s or early 70s and onwards? Or are we seeing the real Jane who just makes use of doubles? On page 234 of Memoirs, it talks about the lyrics to She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, a song which was inspired by Jane helping Billy to break into Paul's house in 1966, not long after Paul was killed and when they didn't have a key. The song includes the line, "She said she'd always been a dancer." Memoirs sets the record straight about Jane's influence on that song, stating, "She had always been an actress, not a dancer." Why does this statement use the past tense? Why not say, "She has always been an actress, not a dancer," if she's still alive? That statement would also be true if we are seeing one continuous Jane Asher throughout time to the present. The next few slides are of Jane's in the late 60s and early 70s. Here is a checklist of things to consider whilst looking at Jane and her possible doubles. The shape of her ears. Jane's were rounder with smaller lobes. Her teeth and smile. Jane had slightly smaller teeth on the left side of her smile. The size of her nose. Many of her doubles seem to have bigger or longer noses. The size of her eyes and the distance between them. Some of the doubles have more space between their eyes. The length of the face and the size of the forehead. Jane's doubles tend to have longer faces. Freckles on the arms. Jane had loads of these. Many of her doubles don't. So here we have double number 1. I'm not sure that this is the same Jane, as she seems to have a longer face, slightly longer nose. Double number 2. Again, a very different nose. Double number 3, who looks completely different to me. More space between the eyes. Double number 4, who has a small, very round face. Double number 5, who again seems to have more space between her eyes. So now we come to a timeline that I've constructed of official pictures of Jane Asher. Most of these are taken from Getty Images, so that I could be absolutely sure of the date that they occurred. Some of them are also screenshots from TV or film appearances. We start here in 1963 with a still shot of an episode of The Saint. And she's very young here. She's only 17. Some more pictures from later in 1963. She looks strange here. She seems to have a very different nose. Some more pictures now from 1964. This looks more recognisably like Jane. And some more pictures from 64. Some pictures in 1965. And the teeth seem to be her teeth. You can just about make out the freckles on her arms on the right-hand side of this picture. Some images from 1966 after she was in the film Alfie. And here she is on the right with Michael Caine. He is 6'1.5", and you can definitely see the difference in their height. Some more images from 1966. Again, you can see the freckles on her arms, even in black and white. Very strange looking pictures of her in 1967. And again, some more pictures from 1967. The one on the right is taken just a few days before she was engaged to Billy. 1968. The one on the left is from one of her theatre productions. I don't think the woman on the right is her. The teeth seem very different. Some more pictures with Billy. These appear to be the real Jane. 1969, and maybe you can't see because the picture will be too small, but this definitely seems like Jane. The teeth seem to be hers. And she's standing outside the Jury Theatre in this group shot. And after this point, there seem to be not very many pictures of Jane. I really struggled at this point to find pictures of Jane from 1969 and the very early 70s. Here are some shots from the film Deep End, which was released in 1970, and I've inserted some images of her arms and her ear. It does sort of look like Jane's ear, but this seems like a very strange film for her to have been in. If you've watched this film, you'll know it's very erotic. Jane plays an attendant at a public bathhouse and swimming pool at a time when not everyone had an indoor bathroom. And to be frank, she plays a sex worker on the sly. Jane at this point had played princess characters and sort of lowly, downtrodden women, but she definitely didn't play sex workers. So this seems very strange. And the promo picture is particularly interesting. Spoiler alert, her character dies at the end of the film. And she dies from a fatal head wound. Does that sound familiar? And she bleeds to death in a swimming pool. And that's why we see the blood coming from her head in this shot. And it's surrounded by that checkerboard, which I also find suspicious. And it has this interesting tagline as a film. If you can't have the real thing, you do all kinds of unreal things. I wonder what they're trying to tell us with that one. So back to the timeline of other images of her from 1970. We have a paparazzi shot on the right and a shot of her from a play on the left, if indeed these are Jane, which I'm not entirely convinced they are. 1971. Is this really Jane? I'm not sure. 1970, different ear, as we saw earlier. 1976, looks like a totally different woman. 1977, those different ears again. And a shot of a Jane Asher in episode of The Goodies on the right. 1978, and these two Janes don't even look like each other. Look how different their noses are. 1980, this woman looks a bit more familiar as the Jane that we know, but I'm still not entirely convinced that it's her. 1984, not sure if this is really Jane. 1985, very different nose on this Jane. And again in 1987, different noses. She's standing with her husband on the right. 1988, a slightly more familiar looking Jane, but I'm again still not entirely convinced that this is really her. 1990, a weirdly blonde Jane with totally odd teeth. Again, standing with her husband on the right. 1991, in a shot for Comic Relief. So some more charity work here. Again, I'm not entirely convinced that this is Jane, although it does look more familiarly like her. In 1994, this is the Jane that I think of when I think of Jane Asher, because I'm so used to seeing her in all of those baking programs on TV, all of those baking related adverts all the way through the 90s. 1999, again another image of the baker Jane Asher for Comic Relief. And if you look through her hair, you can just about make out her long ears, so it's definitely not Jane. And from this point onwards, in fact, we see nothing but long-eared Janes. Here we are in 2001. Again, she's with her husband on the left. Long-eared Janes, all the way 2002. Very odd nose, long ears, weird teeth. And it's pretty much like that all the way until the end now. 2003, 2004, some more from 2004, some more from 2004. This looks actually like a completely different woman. And she's had her teeth fixed. And again, wrong nose. Here in 2004, an interesting photograph of someone called Jane Asher with the Queen in it. A very interesting handshake with the Queen. 2005, she's had her teeth fixed, or she's a different woman, one or the other. And again, some more in 2005, long ears, different nose, standing with her husband. And again, 2006, much more straight teeth. Here we start to see the other Jane, the Jane that we see all the way from 1970 onwards. In this photograph, we can tell from her teeth, she shows more gum on the right-hand side of her smile because her teeth are slightly bigger on the left. And again, we can see that same Jane on the left here. Weirdly blonde Jane again on the right. 2008. 2009. Again, we see the Jane with the more gum showing on the right-hand side of her smile and bigger teeth on the left. Some more from 2009. Again, she's with her husband on the left. 2010. 2011. We see the Jane with more gum showing on the right-hand side of her smile and bigger teeth on the left. 2012. Again with her husband in both of these shots. Another one. 2012. And again we see the same Jane Asher with those same teeth. More gum showing on the right, bigger teeth on the left. And again, same here in 2013. The lady on the far left is Jane's daughter, or this Jane Asher's daughter. 2014, we see the freckles on this lady on the right, but it's a different pattern from the pattern of freckles that the real Jane Asher had. And again, we see the same lady, long ears showing more gum on the right-hand side of her smile and bigger teeth on the left. Here she is again with her husband. Some more from 2015. And some more from 2015. Same teeth, same ears. Another one from 2015. And 2016. Same woman, same smile, same teeth, same ears. 2016 again with her husband on the right. And here we see a really clear shot of those ears. Long ears, not Jane's ears, not round. 2017. And then finally 2019. And we see those same teeth, more gum showing on the right, and those long ears. And quite a different nose as well. And I'm going to leave you with this image. Again, we see those round ears that Jane had as a child, that she still had at 21 in 1967, and that from 1970 and onwards, she no longer seemed to possess. So are we really looking at Jane, or are we looking at a lifelong actor that came in to this story sometime around the end of 1969 or 1970? And is Jane's story one that mirrors Paul's? Because the reason why people think that Paul is not dead is because they've seen Billy in his timeline for such a long time that they accept him as Paul. Maybe we accept this woman on the far right as Jane because she's been in the official Jane Asher timeline for almost as long. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.